All right, it is 1 o'clock on the dot, so let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone, again. Welcome to our Bringing Plant Diversity to Your Landscape, Invasive and Native Plants of the Hudson Highlands webinar. We're really glad you could join us this afternoon. I'm Ashley Rauch. I'm the Community Engagement Manager with the Hudson Highlands Land Trust. We are a nonprofit land conservation organization that protects the natural resources and scenic beauty of the Hudson Highlands region of New York. We are really lucky to have our two expert speakers with us today. First up, we have Ryan Gulick. He is the Terrestrial Invasive Species Project Manager with the Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, and that is a project of the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference, and also a mouthful of a title. So Ryan will talk to us about some of the most common invasive plants in our area, how we can identify them, and how you can manage them on your own property. So our second speaker is Jen Lerner, and she is the Senior Resource Educator at the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Putnam County. So Jen is going to give us an overview of how you can help native plants thrive and how you can support a beautiful and biodiverse landscape on your own property. So before I turn it over to our presenters, I just have a few quick reminders. Like I said before, please keep yourself on mute for the duration of the webinar. You can keep your video on if you'd like. We're really happy to see your faces. Ryan and Jen will take your questions at the end of both their presentations, so please hold them until the end. We'll ask you to submit the questions through the chat box, and I will remind you of that again once we get to the Q&A section. And finally, a recording of this webinar is going to be available on our website and YouTube channel tomorrow in case you miss anything. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Ryan to dig into invasives. Thank you, Ryan.
All right. Just a heads up to keep your eye on the waiting room. I've been letting people in as they've been coming in. All right, so Ashley introduced me. My name is Ryan Gulick. I'm the Terrestrial Invasive Species Project Manager with the Lower Hudson PRISM. And I'll be talking to you about the ecology, identification, and management of some of the most common invasives that you'll see in your area. So first, it's good to define what an invasive species is, and there is a federal definition for this. It is a species that is not native to the ecosystem, and it causes or is likely to cause economic, environmental, or human health harm. And this harm must significantly outweigh the benefits of whatever that species is. And how do invasives cause harm? Well, they take up a lot of space and resources that native species need, and they tend to outcompete and crowd out native species. They can directly attack native species as well, or they could also modify the environment. So they can change the nutrients that are available. They can change the oxygen content in the soil or the water, and some invasive species can even put chemical inhibitors into the soil or water and modify the environment, making it more difficult for anything but itself to grow there. And it's important to know that some of these effects can be persistent. So even after an invasive species is removed, some of these effects can persist, and the soil or water could be continued to be modified after the removal. And so we're talking about invasives and how they impact natives, but why are natives so important? If we want to protect biodiversity, we must protect native species. Most native species of insects are adapted to eat native plants, so they can't really eat the invasive plants. There's a coevolution there where native insects have evolved to overcome the defenses of native plants, but they can't really do that with the invasive plants. Native plants support the highest volume of insects, And it's useful to think about insects and bugs as the ecological currency of the world, because a lot of different species, particularly birds, depend on insects as their food source. So the big picture here is that more invasive plants means less native plants and less biodiversity overall. And diverse ecosystems are healthy ecosystems. So species interactions help keep that complex species web intact. And healthy ecosystems perform ecosystem services better. And so that's to our benefit and the benefit of the plants and animals in those ecosystems. And we're talking about things like cleaner air and water, pollinators for food sources, flood mitigation, climate change mitigation, and the list goes on. The top invaders that you'll see in the forest around you are Japanese barberry, Japanese stiltgrass, multiflora rose, wineberry, oriental bittersweet, garlic mustard, burning bush, Norway maple, Japanese honeysuckle, and tree of heaven. Many of these were originally planted as ornamental plants. That's how a lot of our invasive species get here. And these are all widespread invasives. So they are considered tier 4 by the Lower Hudson Prism. And you can check out more species and how we've categorized them at lhprism.org. So these are the tools that you're going to need for management. I've bolded the tools at the top. These are probably the most important tools that you'll need. Paper and pencil are great for keeping data, which you can upload to iNaturalist or IMAP Invasives. And that's kind of a citizen scientist database that helps inform land managers like myself about what invasive species are out there and what's being done about them, what's being managed and not. Handsaw, pruners, and loppers are going to be your best tools for cutting invasive plants. Tarp will help you move around plant material after it's removed. Garbage bags are important for if the invasive plant you're moving is in seed. You're not going to want to leave that in the environment. You're going to want to bag it up and remove it. And gloves and eye protection are going to be pretty necessary for a lot of these invasive plants because they like to fight back. They do not like to be taken out of the ground. Flagging material is great for if you go before you do management, you can flag out the individual plants, or you can flag out a perimeter for where your work area is going to be. Shovels, hand trowels, soil knives, and pickmatics are going to be awesome tools for you as well if you have them. The most important thing when you're doing invasive species management is getting as much of the root out as possible. So digging tools will really be your friends here. And my favorite is the pickmatic, which has a pointy end on one side that's for leveraging out a plant and a flat end on the other that's used for digging. And then there are some larger tools that might help you as well. A weed wrench will help you pull larger shrubs and trees out of the ground, and a mower or weed whacker can help you if you want to do continuous cuts. All right, so the first invasive that I'll tell you guys about is burning bush, or Euonymus alatus. This is a shrub that can grow 15 to 20 feet tall. It has opposite branching. So when we're talking about branching pattern, you can see here, these leaves come out directly opposite of each other on the stem. They have green leaves that turn red in the fall. And the stems also have corky ridges on them. So the stems can be green to brown depending on how old the plant is, but most of the time they'll also have corky ridges that you can see here on this example in the top left. There are some pretty severe impacts of burning bush, especially if you get an infestation as large and dense as you can see in this picture here. They grow incredibly dense into thickets that outcompete and crowd out native species, and they can also tolerate a wide range of different environmental conditions. So for management, with small plants, it's pretty easy to pull these out of the ground. You can pull or dig them out, and that's pretty easy for plants that are up to about 2 feet tall. For larger plants, you can cut the plant close to the ground, but if you don't dig up the root, that's going to be a continued effort that you need to go back and recut that same plant year after year. I tend to try and dig up any plant that I'm removing with manual means, and you could use a shovel or a pickmatic to do this. And it's important to do management at the right time as well. So this is going to be for pretty much every plant. It's going to be before the seeds develop. And for burning bush, that's going to be mid-fall, around September. The next plant is Japanese barberry, Berberis thunbergii. And this is another shrub, also in the ornamental trade. You'll see a lot of people have these, a purple variety in their yard. In the forest, it reverts back to that original green phenotypic expression. So you won't see a lot of purple burning bush in the woods, but you'll see a lot of green. This shrub can grow 2 to 7 feet tall. Yes, it can grow 7 feet tall. It can grow taller than you. It has really thin needle-like thorns that like to break off and get stuck in your skin. And these leaves are pretty round. They have a spatulated shape, and they grow along the length of each branch. You can also see here that the berries turn bright red, and they can persist through the winter and even be visible in the spring the next year. This plant has quite a few impacts because of the humid environment that it creates with the dense thickets. It's a great habitat for white-footed mice, and ticks love to be on white-footed mice. So there can be up to 9 times as many ticks in a barberry-infested area than a non-barberry-infested area. So that's a huge implication for human health with Lyme disease and other diseases that ticks can transmit. This plant can also increase the invasive earthworm population. And invasive earthworms very quickly turn over the leaf litter, which is valuable for seedling recruitment for native plants and also for salamanders and other critters that like to live on top of the soil. So for Japanese barberry, again, you're going to want to pull or dig these out. Small plants, it's pretty easy to do so. You're definitely going to want to wear gloves. I like to wear 2 pairs of gloves, one that's kind of tight to my hand and then leather gloves on top of that. And you'll want to pile this plant on rocks off trail. And that's because this plant can pretty easily reroot if you just leave it on the ground after you pull it. For larger plants, again, you want to cut it close to the ground or dig it up with a shovel or pickmatic. It's easiest if you cut it and then you dig it up because of the thorny branches that you're going to deal with. So when are you going to want to do this? The seeds develop in late fall, so September, October time. You're going to want to do management before then. If you want to completely remove your barberry infestation, you'll need to do multiple cuttings every summer. But you should not cut this plant in the winter because that will encourage new growth and kind of defeat the purpose of management. It'll be one step forward and two steps back if you cut it in the winter. Okay, we have another thorny plant next, multiflora rose or Rosa multiflora. This plant has compound leaves, meaning that it has multiple leaflets per leaf. You can see in the picture on the left, where I'm circling with my mouse right now, that's all one leaf there. There's about 9 leaflets per that one leaf. So this plant has hooked thorns, and that will help you identify it compared to other rose species. But the big identifying factor for multiflora rose is that it has this fringed stipule here. And I'll show you what a non-fringed stipule looks like in the next slide. If you're looking from May to June, you'll also see clusters of small white flowers as well. So we have 2 native roses in the area, Carolina rose and Virginia rose. And here I'm just highlighting the example of a non-fringed entire stipule here versus a fringed stipule on the multiflora rose. So this plant is notoriously bad because it can produce 500,000 seeds each year. That is an incredible amount of seeds, and what makes that worse is that the seeds can remain viable for up to 20 years in the seed bank. And they crowd out native, higher quality food sources. When you're doing management, you'll want to pull or dig out small plants. Again, careful to remove all the roots because many plants can just regrow from any leftover roots behind. Or you could cut to the roots and repeat this as needed. If you are just pruning multiflora rose to perhaps get it out of a trail, it's only going to stimulate growth. So if you are managing rose, you should definitely either dig it up or cut it at the base and continue to keep your eye on it. And these seeds will again ripen in the late fall. Oriental bittersweet is one of my least favorite invasives. It's a vine that grows up trees, and you can see in this picture on the left, it kind of acts like a boa constrictor and tightens around a tree and slowly chokes it to death, removing the ability for that tree to transport nutrients and water up and down to the leaves and the roots. So bittersweet has alternate branching, and it has very round-shaped leaves. And the Latin name helps you a little bit here, Celastris orbiculatus. It has orb right there in the name. Sometimes these leaves do have a bit more of a pucker on the tip and are less orb-shaped, but generally they'll be pretty round. New vines are going to be green, whereas older vines will be gray to brown, and the fruits will be reddish orange, and they come out in the fall. So impacts of bittersweet, they'll girdle and choke plants. They also will shade out things in the understory beneath it. and it could also weigh down and actually pull down trees. Um, Bittersweet contributes to up to 10% of mature tree mortality in bittersweet infested areas, and it's easily spread by birds along trails and corridors. Young vines can be pulled up, but you're gonna need to pull it up slowly, because as you're pulling it up, it's going to keep going, and you'll need to pull it up slowly so that you can follow where it's going and not snap that root. For larger vines, you're going to want to cut it as low to the ground as possible and as high up as you can. It might take multiple cuttings to do so, but this plant, it's easier to just cut this plant rather than digging it up because of how extensive the root systems are. It'll also reduce the damage to trees if you cut the vine. But it's important that you don't pull off the vines off of trees because you can damage the tree, and then you could also damage yourself by pulling down dead branches. And this management should take place before July through August when the fruits ripen. Okay, we also have garlic mustard, Alliaria petiolata. This is a biennial plant, so it takes 2 years to drop its seed. In the first year, it is pretty round and has rounded teeth that has a U shape near the base of the plant. They can be pretty variable in size. They can be very large or pretty small. And the second year plant will be tall and have pointy leaves with white flowers and long upright seed pods. Here are some lookalikes. You can see garlic mustard here versus violet here, which has a darker green, and the veins are a little bit different on a violet where they arc towards the tip rather than the garlic mustard where they just kind of go out in all different directions. Ground ivy also looks similar, but ground ivy has a square stem. So this is one of those plants that can change the soil chemistry. They put out chemicals into the soil that disrupt fungal associations. And this plant is also toxic to butterflies. So this is easily hand pulled. It's a great activity for kids, but you'll want to get it before June because that's when the seeds ripen. And if you're pulling in June, the seed pod is explosive, and so the seeds will just go everywhere. You'll want to bag it as you remove it because of the chemicals that can be put into the soil if you leave it there. And if you pull it every year for 3 to 6 years, you should exhaust the seed bank and get some pretty good results. The last plant I'll talk about is Japanese stiltgrass, or Microstegium viminium. This is a light green grass that has a shiny stripe down the blade of grass. And that's a pretty good identifying factor there. It's pretty weak stemmed and has a pretty shallow root system. Japanese stiltgrass can look pretty different when it's younger. It's a lot shorter, lighter green. That silver stripe might not be there, but if you look for last year's leaf litter, this thatch here, this hay material, is a pretty good indicator that there was stiltgrass there. This plant can also change the soil chemistry and increase invasive earthworms in the area, and they can completely replace the understory and prevent seedlings from establishing. Removal can take about 5 years if you pull it annually. And you'll want to pull it before the seeds mature, which is usually in late August or early September. You could also weed whack it in late August, right before it goes to seed, and that should prevent it from going to seed that year. So in general, if seeds are present, you'll want to make sure that you brush off your pants, shoes, and tools to avoid spreading the seed after management. You'll want to bag and dispose of seeds in the trash. And it's good practice to double bag any plant material. You'll want to pile plants on a large flat rock if possible, and then monitor that area in case any seeds escape from there. If there is not a rock to place it on, you'll want to put that pile within the infestation as concentrated as possible so you know where the seeds might be in the year to come. And then you'll also want to avoid moving any plants outside of the infested area. Monitoring the site often is pretty important. Going back and checking in on your work so that you can keep up with any plants that are growing again or growing from the remaining root fragments. I've talked a bit about disposal of the plant material already. You could also put it in a wood chipper. You can hang things from branches. And I also mentioned that if you've recorded data, that it'd be great to enter it on either imapinvasives.org or iNaturalist. And one of the best ways to prevent invasives from coming back is to replant with native plants. And it's pretty important to be targeted with management. You can see here that on this map, all the blue dots represent uninvaded areas. And so we're protecting the uninvaded areas by removing invasives within this invaded area here. It makes a lot more sense for us to target this area than to target this area here by the trailhead that is pretty heavily infested. And some tips for you guys, focus on fruiting plants so that you can prevent the seed from dropping. Work from the edge towards the center. If you flag plants, that could be easier for you if you do it in advance so that you don't miss any of them. Or if you're bringing volunteers, they'll be much more easily able to find and remove the plants. Volunteers are always helpful. Many hands make light work. Management is going to be easiest in the spring and the fall when the soil is moist. Especially for thorny plants, if you clip the branches before digging it up, that will be very helpful for you as well. If you plant new native plants, you'll want to protect them from deer herbivory, and you could either do that with a tree tube or with deer spray. You'll want to take breaks often. Don't overexert yourself. You'll be sorry about it the next day. And if you're going to be out there alone, bring headphones. It helps make your day go by quicker. I like to just put one headphone in instead of both so that you can be aware of your surroundings. And that's it for me. I'll turn it on over to Jen and take any questions at the end.
Great. Just sharing my screen. Let's stick here. All right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Ryan. That was a great start, and it's a tough topic because many of us who are gardeners are continuously butting heads with invasive species. But as we look towards managing our landscape, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we incorporate more and more native plants into those landscapes to support a beautiful and biodiverse managed landscape. So as I go on here, I did want to have about 20 minutes and then we'll leave some time for questions. I want to spend some time going through our quick rundown of what I'm going to talk about. One will be to dispel some myths. Then we'll talk a little bit about right plant, right place, what habitat fragmentation is, and why we as an organization are championing native plants. And that's a lot to do in 20 minutes, so we're really going to touch on this. And at the end, I hope to give you some resources. Ashley will share them with you after the presentation, so you can do a little more exploration and research yourself. Oops. Why does that happen? There we go. So quickly just dispelling some myths. Now, there's a lot of times I hear people will say native plants are this, native plants are that, they'll do this and they'll do that. But really, each plant is an individual species of plant, and it has different requirements and will behave differently in different landscapes. So for the first question, native plants are well adapted to managed landscapes. True or false? Well, sometimes. They really are sometimes well adapted to managed landscapes and sometimes not. Native plants don't get any insects or diseases. Well, that's false. And it's really false in the sense that one of the reasons we do plant native plants is that they harbor native insects. And those native insects, as Ryan said previously, are kind of the ecological currency of a diverse habitat. So we do actually want them to harbor insects. Native plants are better adapted to deer browsing? False. They really, unfortunately, are very susceptible to deer browsing. And that's one of the things that gives invasive species an edge on them. Many of the invasive species that Ryan just mentioned are very deer resistant. The deer don't browse them. If they're not browsing them, they turn to a smaller and smaller population of native plants that then further get devoured. Native plants are sturdy survivors. Also, sometimes, if they're in a good location with the right soil and great conditions, they can be excellent. Do they require less fertilizer or pesticide input? Again, sometimes. So what I'm trying to focus on here and reiterate is that much as we like to think of it, there's really no magic to native plants. It comes down to getting the right plant in the right place. And this goes for any plant you choose in your landscape. Don't fall in love with it until you figure out what it needs. As we just saw, if you get the right plant in the wrong space or the wrong plant in a great space, you're going to have more interventions. They could be simple things like fertilizer, pesticides, but all of those have environmental impacts as well. Or they might require more labor, like pruning or removal, or in the sense of invasive species, very expensive management that takes crews of people many, many years to just suppress, not even eradicate. So all of these things really turn us to trying to find the right plant for the space that you have. So I want to show a little bit of the resources that you can tap. But first looking at the real definition of why something is native, what it needs to succeed in that natural environment. And looking at the soil and environmental conditions that a plant needs, that defines the plant community. And if you look on the right, it's a little blurry, but I think you can probably make it out. These are planting lists from the Pollinator Partnership. And the Pollinator Partnership is an organization that champions native plants as well, specifically to support pollinators. But you'll see they didn't just make one list. They made a different list for each area of the continental United States. And our area is served by two different lists here. One is the Eastern Broadleaf Forest, the oceanic region, versus the Eastern Broadleaf Forest, the continental version. And within each of those lists, yes, there are a lot of plants that are the same, but there are some plants that are a little different. And that's also because plants are really defined by the soil and stone, the rock, bedrock outlay of the area. So If you look at the map on the right, you'll see, sorry, let me minimize for a second here. There we go. If you look at the map on the right, you see a basic map of New York State's soils. I just want you to compare that with this next slide. On the left is a distribution of our native ash trees, and then just kind of take a look at how that relates to the map on the right. There is a concentration of that particular species that coordinates or compares with the, see, can you see my cursor right here? This area on the right here. Yes, the tree is distributed throughout the state as well, not so much in the Adirondacks, that big brown section up there, but you can see how the distribution of ash trees really relates to the soil of New York State. So if you want to have success with native plants, you really have to dive into what they need, because if you pick a plant because you love it, and you stick it in a place where it won't succeed, the plant will die and you will be discouraged, and you'll have lost some money too. You know, it really makes sense to do your homework first. So one of the things that you need to know is what are the conditions that make that plant thrive. And I have an example here, which I don't expect you to memorize there, but this is for the Lobelia cardinalis on the right. This beautiful plant that supports pollinators and is visited by hummingbirds. It has very specific requirements, including the soil. And I do like this particular website because they really go into the soil requirements of plants. Again, it's a very broad set of soil descriptions there. So you could see that there's a relative tolerance for different soils for this particular plant. But then it goes down below to say the soil must be kept moist or wet at all times. So that is a really important part to note. You're not going to put this in an upland rocky site that doesn't get any moisture. So in order to be successful, you really need to know what the plants need. Where do you get that information? Well, it's research, research, research. If you're going to take a shot of a slide, I know we're going to share this, but this might be helpful for you to just take a picture of it with your cell phone or a screenshot with your computer. On the top, there are 3 websites where you could find basic but detailed cultural information about plants. Below that are pollinator focused, more specific by zip code. These websites have excellent information and a lot of detail that are going to help you make good choices on the plants that you pick out. So again, you don't have to quickly jot these all down. We'll also be sharing this. As Ashley said earlier, you can find it on the Hudson Highlands Land Trust YouTube channel as well. So I did want to spend some time talking about habitat fragmentation because as Ryan was speaking earlier, invasive plants and disturbance are quickly reducing the habitat that native animals have. As we develop more areas and as we reduce the plant diversity, so too we are seeing a reduction in abundance and diversity of insects and birds. And that's very concerning for us, but I hope that today, since we don't have a lot of time to go into that, we can at least talk about habitat fragmentation and the way your landscape can help to reduce the impacts. So habitat fragmentation is actually, I want to talk, well, let's just jump to the next slide. Our yards and landscapes, vegetable containers, our gardens can actually provide forage and shelter, water, and nesting sites for pollinators. And the higher the percentage of native plants, the better. And if you think of each of these stones, these stepping stones in this landscape as your garden or a neighbor's garden, or perhaps it's a community garden down the street, or it's a farmer's field and a hedgerow that's in bloom. The closer those stepping stones are, the shorter the distance that the birds and insects visiting those plants have to travel. When those yards are near each other, we do see an abundance and diversity of organisms. That's much higher than if they're widely dispersed. So by creating landscapes with native plants that are close to each other, we help to increase the abundance and diversity of pollinators and birds. When those landscapes are farther apart, and that often happens when we have development or when landscapes are primarily single species or just a few species of trees, shrubs, or grasses, those spaces are wider apart. They don't provide good habitat, and that populations represented by those little blue dots are no longer really resilient. They can't breed with nearby populations. Should one of those populations be completely removed, say there is a new development or a tree lot is cut down, there's no longer a stepping stone for other populations to jump to. That population might be snuffed out, but the effect on the populations nearby are seen as well. So here the idea being is that we want to promote population diversity and abundance by creating diverse landscapes of native plants. I'm actually going to skip back a couple of slides. I think I got these a little out of order here. To do that, there's a lot of organizations working on pollinator pathways, also sometimes called green corridors. These are a method of creating contiguous habitat or places where animals and insects can live that are near each other. So you sometimes hear of pathways or sometimes pockets where you have a small park that has native plants and provides habitat, but it has to be near another one really to make a resilient community. So now I'm going to jump back ahead a couple of slides here. Sorry about that. Diversity. Native plants oops, oh dear. Are you able to hear me? Am I cutting out on you? I just got a message that my internet connection is unstable.
You cut out, but you're okay now. We can hear you now.
Thanks. So plant-animal relationships are very specific. There are some that are very general, but in many cases, there's specific relationships between insects and plants. In the case of pollinators, it can be specific plants that pollinators visit because of the shape of their tongue. And their tongue may be well adapted to feeding on only a few types of plants. In the case of butterflies, specific plants might be the larval host for some butterflies. They also provide excellent nesting habit, and that sometimes is simply because of the way they branch. And also, these wonderful little insects are often food for nestling or fledgling birds. So if you look at the photo on the right, this is a caterpillar of an emerald butterfly. And if you're having a hard time finding it, don't worry. The first time I saw it was only because I saw it moving. The yellow arrow is its head, and the white arrow are its feet. And it's covered itself with the flowers and flower debris of a short-toothed mountain mint, and that's its preferred host food. So this particular insect is really tied to a small group of plants that it feeds on. The other group that we're really worried about, we talked about insects, but it's birds as well. Birds population have decreased by about 3 billion birds since the 1970s. That's a lot of birds. And habitat loss is implicated as the #1 factor in that decline. What studies have shown, though, is that managed landscapes that include a lot of native plants can provide improved habitat for native songbirds. And there's a lot of back and forth about how much is enough. You know, some people say it's got to all be native plants, but we're not going to say to you, go out there now and rip out all your non-native plants, because those non-native plants can currently bee providing habitat. So it's a slow phase out over time to increase the amount of native plants that you have in your landscape. So previously, Ryan called insects we'll go back to that slide. What did you call insects? The ecological currency of the landscape, and they really are. They're drivers of a lot of our biodiversity. Without pollinators, many plants would not have a way to reproduce. While some older plants are wind pollinated, many native plants that flower are pollinated by insects or other pollinators. Without the nectar and pollen that those flowers produce, that abundance and diversity of those insects would decline. And again, I mentioned before that some are very specialized relationships. Some are general. Bumblebees are generalist pollinators. They can get away by eating a lot of things. But some bees are specifically adapted to feeding on just a few plants. I want to think that as we increase the native abundance of plants in our landscapes, that we also need to change our perception of what is good, what is okay. When people put plants in the lab, I had a phone call in the lab, I put plants in the landscape. I wanted to have these butterfly plants for the monarchs, but some caterpillars eating them. And we had to have the conversation with this particular person that the caterpillar is the reason that they did put those plants in their landscape. The caterpillar was a monarch caterpillar, and it was munching down the butterfly bush. And butterfly bushes do attract butterflies to the flowers, but one of their chiefest benefits is the fact that they support insect development. It's a larval host for several insects, and the idea for this plant is for it to get eaten. And for us, a lot of times, when we see our plant getting eaten, we want to go ahead and do something about it. That often includes pesticides or removal of the insect. So we really need to change our perception about these plants. If we're putting native plants in the landscape, we're doing it to increase biodiversity. And it's not just for pollinators, for bumblebees and butterflies to feed on. It is for insects to reproduce on. So caterpillars, sawflies, aphids are all going to find those native ornamentals tasty too. So those soft-bodied insects, as Ryan said, you could think of them as the French fries of the insect world. They're really easy to eat. They don't fight back. Those caterpillars, sawflies, aphids are tender morsels that other insects and animals can eat. And they feed millions. So our use of pesticides in the landscape can, in fact, affect the population of those soft-bodied insects, and you can imagine that ripple effect outward. So as I start to wrap up here, let's get this slide. I did want to talk about the idea of creating pathways of native plants to support pollinators. There are national and regional efforts. You can check them out on pollinatorpathway.com. In Putnam County, we have several efforts as well that include the Putnam Pollinator Pathway and the Phillipstown Pollinator Pathway. I encourage you to go check those out, and we will forward you the links to those pollinator pathways. Westchester also has a pollinator pathway, and the Housatonic to Hudson Pollinator Pathway has many organizations that are included in this pollinator pathway, but you're all invited to join a pollinator pathway, even if what you have is a pot of flowering plants on your deck. That helps as well, as sure you've seen insects are visiting those plants. But for native plant ideas, continue to follow us on Instagram. If you're not following us on Instagram, please do. At CCE Putnam, we feature at least one native plant a week with some information about the insects that it supports. If you have questions, please email us at mastergardener.putnam@gmail.com. And you can visit our website for links to these organizations if you'd like, and more hints on creating a pollinator paradise. And that includes a really beautiful bloom chart of native plants. So as you plan your landscape, you can plan out what blooms when, and include these beautiful plants in your landscape. So at that, I'm going to leave it open for, I'm going to unshare and leave it open for questions. Is that okay, Ashley? Are we in a good spot?
That's great. Yes, thank you, Jen. So we have about 10 minutes left for questions. We ask that you submit your questions through the chat box, and to access that chat box, right in the middle of the toolbar at the bottom, just click on that chat link and you should be able to type a message into everybody. We will all see those questions come in. We've already had a few questions come in that Ryan already addressed, one on disturbed soil, one on deer spray. So why don't we start here with Michelle's question on the best place to put invasives once you pull them. Should you put those in the trash rather than your municipal yard waste? Ryan, do you want to address that?
Yeah, sure. If the municipal yard waste is dumping the plants without having them bagged or anything, I would definitely recommend just bagging them and throwing them in the trash rather than just putting them in the municipal plant yard waste area. It is far too easy for a seed to roll away or for the breeze to catch and pick up a plant fragment. And a lot of invasive plants can reproduce just from a fragment of that plant. So I would definitely recommend, if you are going to remove them from your property, yes, bag it. If you can, double bag it. And just throwing it out in the regular trash can be pretty effective. If you do want to put them in the municipal yard waste area, I would recommend bagging it and leaving it out in the sun to solarize that plant before you put it in the municipal yard waste area.
Thanks, Ryan. Do we have any other questions? Again, just type those right into the chat box.
I saw, oh, good. I saw a question about deer repellents. And I did want to mention that because that's a question about pollinators often with deer repellents as well. I don't know if you had a chance to answer it. We are concerned about some deer repellents that include oils like eucalyptus or clove, thyme, things that make them smell a little nicer to us, actually are things that are also labeled as pesticides, insecticides, in fact. So if you're going to use a deer repellent, try to use one that includes only putrescent egg solids. Putrescent egg solids don't smell very good, as you can imagine, but they haven't been shown to be particularly hazardous to pollinators at this time, whereas some of the oils included in some deer repellents are.
Thanks, Jen. So we have another question here from Ann Sims. How do we deal with poison ivy? It's a native, but it's becoming increasingly vigorous.
Yeah, so I would say leave it. The birds really love the berries of poison ivy. But if you want to remove it because it is a nuisance plant, I would probably deal with it the same way that I would deal with bittersweet, where I would cut a large vine near the ground and then cut it up as high as possible. That'll be your tactic for pretty much any vine that you're dealing with. And then for smaller plants, you're definitely going to want to wear as much protective equipment as possible. Long sleeves, gloves, long pants, and you could just pull them out of the ground.
We have another question here from John on microstegium, which I think Jen just addressed.
Sure. Yeah, if you have Japanese stiltgrass is tough. And we have tried using some taller, faster growing perennials to suppress it. These particular ones, Aranchus dioicus, shoot up really early in the spring. So they do suppress the Japanese stiltgrass growth, germination, by creating a very dense very dense canopy of foliage. So it does grow around the edge, but it does grow. This is Aranchus dioicus, grows around 4 to 6 feet tall. So it's a tall perennial. But again, good for a part shade, moist soil. Each choice you make is going to be specific to the location where it's growing. Ryan, do you have any things that have you seen work around it?
Not in particular. Unfortunately, don't have a whole lot of experience with restoration as much as I do with invasive plant removal. But I will say that any time that something is marked as aggressive, aggressive native plants are great substitutions for your invasive plants. Those will be the ones that really have bully tendencies and will try and push out everything around it.
Thanks. Any other questions here? We have a couple more minutes if we have anything else from the audience. What should we do with mile a minute?
Mile a minute. It's another easy one to pull, fortunately. It's very easy to see where mile a minute is growing in the winter after most things have died back, because those vines will stay behind that dead material. So that is your best time to really look for mile a minute. And then going back to that area, making a mental note, okay, I have to go back here in the spring, and really being vigilant to pull out as much as you can. If you do wait until about mid-season, I believe it goes to seed in August. So if you pull it before August, you should be good. If you wait until mid-season, it will be growing. It grows very quickly, and you can roll up the mile a minute. It has these teeny little prickers on it. So it's good to wear gloves and long sleeves to not irritate your hands or your arms. But you can just roll it up and create these giant balls of mile a minute. That it's really fun to pull, and the roots come up very, very easily. So just pulling should be good for that one.
Another question about a specific species, black swallowwort. What do we do with that?
I have seen some people say that digging it up is effective. That is something that's probably better for very small infestations. It'll be pretty labor intensive because the root system can be pretty strong and robust. We tend to use a foliar application on black swallowwort ourselves when we're managing it, but it can be dug up.
And what about Japanese knotweed?
This is a plant that I hear all different types of things about. So I've heard that the most effective thing that you can do is a stem injection with a glyphosate product. Foliar application could also work for that. You're gonna have a very tough time digging out Japanese knotweed. It's got rhizomes underneath the soil that stretch out pretty far and shoot up new plants. I have heard of a method that's being tried out in the UK, where people are cutting down the plant to ground level and then laying down like chicken wire with 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch square mesh wire. And then the new shoots of the Japanese knotweed will grow up through those small holes. And then as it gets older and the plant gets wider, it will girdle itself on those mesh wire.
So we had here a comment from Maureen about poison ivy, about how it has gotten much worse since the 1950s, but it absorbs a lot of CO2, so it might be friendly to climate change. Thanks, Maureen, for pointing that out. And then one more species-specific question on wineberry. How bad is that?
Wineberry. I don't like to play favorites, but it is my favorite invasive. A very nice snack on the trail. So it can get pretty bad. In regards to how bad invasive raspberries get in general, you can think about Himalayan blackberry in the Northwest, and you can see just how bad that gets. It's extremely widespread. They're very dense thickets. I personally haven't seen large infestations of wineberry. But I do know that it can get pretty bad. It can get pretty dense and thickety. So it does pull up pretty easily if you can bear with the thorns a little bit. You can really just yank it out of the ground. And if you're not going to manage it, at least pick off all the berries so that the birds aren't spreading them.
Thanks, Ryan. And thank you, Anne, for your comment on the black swallowwort in the chat box. We are a minute over, so we are going to have to end it there. Thank you very much to Ryan and Jen for your excellent presentations. Thank you all for joining us. It's really great to see you here today. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a recording available tomorrow. That'll be on our website, which is hhlt.org, and also our YouTube channel. If you'd like to revisit this webinar at any point. And I will also tomorrow email around all of the resources that Ryan and Jen shared in their presentations. So look out for that email from me. And thank you again for joining us. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.